In this video, we'll be going over the best glyphs from World of Warcraft's history, and pretty much whatever was the best version of that glyph as well. And at number 10, we have the Glyph of Demon Hunting. This was a glyph that only existed in Mists of Pandaria, and what it did was actually give the Warlock a new ability called Dark Apotheosis, which had a cool visual of giving you permanent demon wings and demon horns, made even cooler with the green fire effect from the Green Fire questline. But enough about visuals, onto the mechanics. It basically just made you a lot more tanky, and gave you a whole bunch of new abilities which transformed some of your spells. More specifically, it reduced your physical damage taken by 10%, magic damage taken by 15%, changed Soul Shatter from dropping all aggro to a provocation, generating aggro, Shadow Bolt becoming Demonic Slash, an instant cast with charges and a 10-yard range, Fear instead putting enemies to sleep, Hellfire becoming Immolation Aura, a constant passive AoE, their Shadow Ward ability instead becoming Fury Ward, absorbing all types of magic damage instead of Shadow, and allowed them to use some of their Metamorphosis-like abilities, like their Nether Plating passive, Demonic Lead, and Carrion Swarm abilities. This has got to be the most amount of changes that a class has received from just a glyph, nearly creating an entire new spec. And obviously, this was incredibly detailed compared to how minor most glyphs are, because a vast majority of glyphs throughout the entire history of the game gave incredibly minor benefits, like just increasing the crit chance with only one ability by 6%. So, gaining an ability which basically allows the class to enter a brand new type of stance and be tank light is kind of impressive. It was basically added by one Warlock developer who was very adamant about allowing Warlocks to tank, something that was possible for short periods of time in Wrath of the Lich King or in various other fights that required a class with high shadow resist. We have a whole video about fights like this, you should go check it out. So, as a compromise, they allowed him to create this glyph, which was removed at the end of the expansion. Now, the glyph didn't allow Warlocks to be a legitimate tank outside of maybe the Dark Shaman's fight, where the caster could be tanked by a Warlock, but it was good enough for off-tanking, as long as you had a very dedicated healer, or even in PvP, because it allowed a Warlock to cast Sleep, and use it as a defensive stance or were doing non-hardcore content like dungeons or scenarios. The glyph itself was never really overpowered either. It was just strong enough to give Warlocks the illusion of being a tank. Overall, it's just a marvelous glyph to discuss in the video, when it comes to the best glyphs in WoW, because none of them have really been as involved as this one since. And at number 9, we have the Glyph of Corpse Explosion, the original one from Wrath of the Lich King. Now, Glyph of Corpse Explosion was a minor glyph, which had the effect that any target killed by your Corpse Explosion ability will also explode, but it only affects targets within range of your Corpse Explosion ability and cannot happen more than once every 6 seconds. Now, what's important about this glyph is the fact that it's a minor glyph. Generally, minor glyphs never increase your DPS by any measure, and some of the best minor glyphs in the game just provide really nice quality of life improvements, like no longer having to feed your pet. And since the original version of Corpse Explosion did almost no damage, the glyph itself was fine, and it didn't really increase your damage by a significant margin, as the ability it modified was kind of a joke. However, in patch 3.08, Corpse Explosion received a major buff. Its damage was significantly increased, it was given a 5-second cooldown, and an actual 40 runic power cost. So using Corpse Explosion was akin to using an actual AoE in this version. However, they forgot to account for the fact that it had a minor glyph associated to it, which technically increased its damage. So, with the new Corpse Explosion actually hitting legitimately hard, the minor glyph was providing a significant DPS increase, on par with major glyphs. And minor glyphs were not supposed to provide DPS increases, so the glyph was nerfed a patch and a half later, which is actually a pretty long time for a glyph to be in the game in its unchanged form, where they simply just made the glyph increase the radius of Corpse Explosion by 5 yards instead. And at number 8, we have the Glyph of Soul Swap. Soul Swap was an ability that Warlocks had, which basically allowed them to collect all of the dots they had on a target, and then transfer them over to a different target. Warlocks have a long history of being the dot class, with each spec having multiple dots as a major part of the rotations, especially Affliction Warlocks, where they could have a whole bunch of dots on a target at one time, to the point where casting them again on another brand new target could take about 5 global cooldowns before they've all properly applied. So Soul Swap was an ability that allows you to move your dots around more easily. That way you didn't have the terrible DPS when trying to burst down a short-lived target. And then there was the Glyph of Soul Swap, which had the effect that when you use Soul Swap, it would allow you to copy the dots you have and pasting them onto another target, instead of simply cutting them off one target and paste them onto another. So the glyph straight up allowed you to have full dots on 2 targets, Well, except for the dots that could only be on a single target, of course. But the glyph essentially allowed you to double up on your dots, assuming you had other targets to swap to. So the best use of this was generally in fights that had more than one boss up at a time, like most council bosses. It would save you a significant amount of global cooldowns from applying all of your dots to targets. More usefully, it was incredibly good in PvP situations, as there's generally always more than one target to attack at once, and being able to apply all of your dots to a priority target instantly with Soul Swap was really good, while also leaving the dots behind on the past target so that they're still taking damage and need to have heals on them. In fact, it was so good, this glyph was constantly nerfed throughout the history of WoW. At first, the only downside to the glyph was adding a 10-second cooldown to the ability, which gradually got increased to 15 seconds, and then ending off at a 30-second cooldown. The glyph was basically a must-have for the ability, so much so that they eventually just made the baseline ability work exactly like the glyph, and then converted the glyph into allowing you to just hold a copy versions of your dots for a longer amount of time, to let you duplicate your dots from one trash pack to another, for example. The glyph was removed from the game in Legion when they removed all the glyphs from the game, and the ability Soul Swap was converted into an honor talent, where it was then just removed from the game halfway through Legion. And at number 7, we have Glyph of Fae Silence. This glyph, added in Mist of Pandaria, had the effect where, when you were in bear form and you used your Fairy Fire ability, it would also silence the target for 3 seconds, but trigger a 15-second cooldown on the ability. So what this meant was that any druid could just swap to bear form in order to silence the target for 3 seconds. Fairy Fire was an ability that had 35-yard range, did a little bit of damage, reduced their armor, and made it so they couldn't stealth or go invisible. So, it's a pretty nice debuff to put on a target. And the most useful way to use the ability was basically by resto druids in PvP situations, where if there was a priority target that needed to be put into a cyclone, what they could do was just go into bear form in order to range silence them first, then run up to them and then cast a cyclone, without fear of being counterspelled or wind sheared. So it was an excellent CC combo tool when trying to lock down a tricky to CC target, like maybe a mage or shaman, who could counterspell your cyclones. And a 15-second cooldown on a 3-second silence is pretty minor. In fact, that's kind of par the course for most interrupts, and is actually really short cooldown for a silence. So the glyph basically gave all druids the ability to silence targets for 3 seconds. But there was always the caveat where you had to go into bear form first in order to do it, which meant a full global cooldown of waiting before you were actually able to use the silence. So it wasn't something you can do in order to reliably interrupt casters. Although even without being able to use the silence as a reliable interrupt outside of bear tanks, it was still incredibly useful as just a preemptive silence to put things into a cyclone, or just a silence to put on a priority kill target so they can't use defensive cooldowns. Silences are just really good in PvP, which is why the glyph was changed in Warlords of Draenor to only be usable by Guardian Druids. That way the DPS and healer druids couldn't take advantage of its excellent CC combo tool, as no one really PvPs as a Guardian Druid anyway. Although even with how good the glyph was, it wasn't thought of as a must-have glyph at the time, and was merely one of the many options they had, which was just very appreciated by a lot of players who got to use it, which is why it's not higher on this list, even though it's a really good glyph. And at number 6, we have the Glyph of Splitting Ice. This was a glyph added in Mist of Pandaria, which simply allowed your ice lance and icicles to hit one additional target for 50% damage. At the time the glyph was added, frost mages were kinda struggling when it came to cleave damage, and the glyph significantly helped them out, to the point where it was basically a must-have. Ice Lance is an instant cast ability, which hits for a very weak amount of damage, but would hit for a lot more damage if it hit a frozen target. And Frost Mages have an ability called Fingers of Frost, which basically allows their abilities to act as if they're hitting a frozen target. So Ice Lance would actually hit pretty hard when used with Fingers of Frost, and allows that damage to passively cleave, which is just a huge DPS increase in a lot of situations. Now, Frost Mages were not the king of AoE DPS with the glyph, but it was such a no-brainer picked up by pretty much every Frost Mage that when they removed the glyphs in Legion, they transformed it into a talent, Splitting Ice, which gave the split to not only your Ice Lance, but also your Icicles and even your Ebon Gold and Glacier Spike. And at number 5, we have the Glyph of Binding Heal. This one's kind of a situation like Glyph of Splitting Ice, where it changed the spell in a fundamental way that was so much better, but this time eventually incorporating it into the original spell itself instead of a talent. Binding Heal is an ability which basically allows you to cast Flash Heal on yourself and one other target, which is basically just an expensive, fast cast, high healing ability. And what the glyph would do was every time you use Binding Heal, it would also target a random low health target within 20 feet of your second target to be healed for the same amount at the cost of the spell being 35% more expensive to cast, which basically meant Binding Heal was hitting 3 targets instead of 2. And the benefits of Binding Heal was always if you just needed to heal someone else quickly, but you were also taking damage as well. So it was kind of a situational healing spell to use that was very useful if you needed to heal yourself up without neglecting the rest of the raid. With the Glyph, it became a lot less of a situational spell and more of just a really good spell, because you could heal 2 other targets for a full flash heal essentially, while also keeping yourself alive. And the fact that it was super expensive to cast was kind of irrelevant, which is how much healing it was able to pump out. In fact, the ability became so good that they kind of removed it from Discipline Priests, as Binding Heal plus the Glyph was just becoming better than the regular toolkit. And if you ever wondered why Binding Heal is only available to Holy Priests today, it's kind of the fault of how good this Glyph was, which is definitely why it takes a higher spot in this video, only below some of the more overpowered Glyphs in WoW's history. And at number 4, we have the Glyph of Garrote. In Cataclysm, Blizzard changed the effect of Glyph of Garrote from its original version, which reduced the bleed's duration but increased its damage, which gave it more burst potential, because of the redesign of the Glyph system. So instead, they gave it a more PvP-focused effect to just increase the silence duration by 2 seconds. As Garrote was an ability, well, at the time anyway, where it could only be used while you were in stealth, would put a bleed on the target, and silence them for 3 seconds. So the Glyph basically just added an additional 66% duration to that silence effect, and having a 5-second silence on an opener from a rogue was just incredibly overpowered in Cataclysm. You see, rogues have the option of 3 openers: Ambush, which just dealt a massive amount of damage and nothing else, Cheap Shot, which would stun the target for 4 seconds, or Garrote, which did a mix of both, where it would silence for 3 seconds, as well as dealing damage over time. Now, normally Cheap Shot was one of the best openers you could use in PvP because of that 4-second stun is just useful against pretty much any target. Except for mages, because mages could just blink out of the stun, and other classes had a way to circumvent the stuns as well, to the point where most of the time rogues would just use Garrote in order to have that silence in order to lock them down. And the Glyph basically turned Garrote into a better opener than Cheap Shot anyway, which was also dealing damage. And it was so incredibly strong that it was nerfed almost immediately. The duration was lowered to 1.5 seconds down from 2, getting lowered again in Mist of Pandaria to only a 1 second increase. So they would be on the same duration as Cheap Shot and no longer be de facto better. Eventually, after Glyphs were removed from the game, Blizzard also made Garrote only usable by assassination rogues, but then also gave them a talent which basically gave them the full effect of the Glyph, as well as giving them a little bit of damage decrease to the target. Now, a Glyph basically being the full effect of a talent is kind of a big deal, because talents are a significant increase to a player's power, whereas Glyphs are kind of minor. So, for a simple Glyph to provide almost the same benefits as a full talent is kind of impressive. And the only reason the talent is a better version of the Glyph was because they removed the ability from Subtlety rogues, which was the rogue that took advantage of the ability the most in PvP anyway. And at number 3, we have the Glyph of Explosive Trap. The old effect of the Glyph used to just allow the explosive trap to be able to critically strike, which was not a baseline thing of AoEs or dots in the early days of the game. So when it was made baseline, they changed the Glyph to have a new effect, where Explosive Trap no longer dealt damage, and would instead knock back enemies from the trap when it exploded. And it kinda knocked them back pretty far too. Explosive Trap is just one of the many traps that hunters were able to use, which when triggered would burn the area for around 20 seconds. The damage was never super impressive, but it did have its niche uses throughout the years. However, in PvP, Explosive Trap was almost completely useless, so having a Glyph which allowed it to be incredibly useful instead was a huge bonus. So good in fact that hunters were basically balanced around the Glyph, and the Glyph had an incredible high skill ceiling to using it correctly too, as positioning the trap in order to knock people in the direction you wanted them to go is pretty difficult, especially during high pressure situations like an arena battle. Although even without proper positioning, it was useful to get melee players off of you, or you can launch it with Trap Launcher, a good way to knock players out in the open or just off of bridges and cliffs. The Glyph was so good that when the Glyph was removed from the game in Legion, the ability to use Explosive Trap in this way was added back as a PvP talent 2 expansions later, because it was basically a staple of PvP hunters' toolkits, and wasn't super useful outside of PvP anyway. And at number 2, we have the Glyph of Holy Light. This Glyph modified the Holy Light ability for Paladins, which was their main big heal brack in Wrath of the Lich King when Glyphs got added, where it would grant 10% of its heal to 5 friendly targets within 100 yards of the initial target. So, in raiding environments where everybody's taking damage, this is equivalent to increasing the healing of your main heal by 50%. And back in Wrath of the Lich King, Paladins didn't really have AoE healing, so this Glyph is one of the only ways they could do any form of splash healing. And it was really good too. The Glyph's healing could account for about 10 to 20% of a Paladin's total healing, which is a significant amount of healing to be provided by a glyph. If you can get some kind of ability or talent that accounts for 5% of your healing, that's considered a really good ability. So the glyph was kind of bonkers on the power scale, in terms of usability. That's why the glyph was nerfed, where later they lowered the range of the glyph to only affect targets within 20 yards of the target, instead of just being an auto everyone in the raid type ability. Where it was then nerfed again, to only affect targets within 8 yards of the main target, and the extra heals from the glyph could no longer critically strike. And all of these nerfs were kind of well deserved because it was ridiculously good, probably one of the best glyphs that Paladins ever had. And it was still used pretty much non-stop even after its multiple nerfs until it was removed in Cataclysm, where they didn't even try to rein in the ability and just got rid of its function altogether. And at number 1, we have the Glyph of Gag Order. This was a glyph added Mist of Pandaria and had the effect where a warrior's pummel and heroic throw abilities would also silence a target for 3 seconds. Pummel is the warrior's main interrupt ability, and at the beginning of Mist of Pandaria it only had a 10-second cooldown. And heroic throw was just a ranged ability that warriors had, which had a 1-minute cooldown at the time and was basically there just to give warriors a ranged option at all. So, having a 3-second silence attached to a 10-second cooldown ability was incredibly powerful. It basically allowed warriors to completely shut down any spellcaster they were attacking, and also giving them an extra silence on their ranged throw ability. Basically meant they could use heroic throw in order to hit a spellcaster at range, that way they couldn't run away for 3 seconds while they close the distance. And then silence them again with the pummel. There was diminishing returns on silences, so they could only realistically use the silence twice before it went on full DRs, but it was still incredibly powerful. So much so that the glyph was nerfed almost immediately, where it got a hotfix only a couple months after the glyph went live, where they changed it so the effect no longer worked on players at all. Even with the tricky situation of the Glyph of Garrote providing too much of a silence benefit to rogues, especially after they shared the cooldowns of the DRs of their cheap shot and kidney shot, they never disabled the ability to work on players. You know something is incredibly overpowered when they straight up don't allow you to use it in PvP scenarios at all. However, funnily enough, the glyph was still overpowered even in PvE only, as in World of Draenor the glyph got nerfed again, where it was given an internal 15-second cooldown, so you could no longer double up on the silence effects from heroic throw and pummel. And before we end this off, let's go over a few honorable mentions, and those would be the Glyph of Death and Decay and Glyph of Unleashed Lightning. The original Glyph of Death and Decay that Death Knights had caused each tick of their AoE spell to have an insane 20% chance to make the target cower in fear for 2 seconds, and was one of the strongest CC glyphs in the game's history, only lasting for 3 months. Glyph of Unleashed Lightning allowed shamans to use lightning bolt while moving, and is one of the best general glyphs in the game's history, only comparable to the Mist of Pandaria Warlock talent Kil'jaeden's Cunning, which was nerfed many times and removed because of how powerful it was as a talent. However, because these two glyphs are incredibly notable, I've mentioned them a lot in other videos, so they're being left out of this video to make it more interesting to repeat viewers. However, they would probably take up the number 1 and 2 spots if I were to shift the rest of the list around a little bit.